My son's wife kicked me out and brought her parents to live in my house. The very next day, they threw a grand, extravagant celebration to mark their conquest of what they believed was now theirs. But I did not come back empty-handed. I returned alongside the property's new rightful owner. Every face in that room went ash white, and the heavy quiet that fell over them was the sweetest thing I had ever witnessed. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close. There are plenty more where this came from, and I'd love to have you along for each one. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Is this your first time sitting down with one of these stories, or have you been here with me before? Let me know below. One more thing worth saying up front. Some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. The name's Gerald Hargrove, 68 years old. The dull thud of scuffed work boots worn by contractors rang out against the concrete floor of my detached garage. Two workers in cheap, unbranded shirts, carrying the faint reek of old cigarettes, were hauling my custom drafting table toward the open driveway. I stood in the doorway, the morning chill cutting through my thin jacket, watching my sanctuary being methodically stripped apart. Serena, my daughter-in-law, hovered a few feet away, furiously jabbing at her glowing phone screen. She never once glanced in my direction. She simply thrust her manicured finger toward the far corner of the space. "Be careful with those lights," she barked at a third worker carrying an oversized LED ring lights. The Nordic Track rowing machine goes right in the center, and the lighting has to be perfect for my morning streams. I watched the rough hands of the contractors grip the thick walnut edge of the drafting table. My jaw-clenched muscles aching from the sudden pressure. I did not scream. I did not fly into a blind rage. A cold, hard knot formed deep in my chest. I had built that drafting table 40 years ago. My late wife, Diane, had held the wooden beam steady while I drove the screws in her laughter, filling that very room the day I accidentally glued my thumb to the drafting board. It was the table where I had designed commercial high-rises. The table that put a roof over my son's head and covered his college tuition. And now it was being dragged to the curb like rubbish to clear space for a rowing machine. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. "Leave the table," I said, voice low, but carrying enough weight to freeze both contractors where they stood. They glanced at me, then at Serena. Serena finally lowered her phone. She exhaled a long, theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes the way someone does when dealing with a difficult child. "Gerald, we've already been through this," she said, her tone soaked in that unbearable artificial sweetness she reached for when cruelty was coming. "The garage is just full of junk. It's completely ruining my aesthetic. I need a wellness space, and this is the only area with enough natural light." I did not raise my voice. "That is not junk, Serena. That is professional architectural equipment, and this is my property." Her sweet expression evaporated on the spot, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly forward. "Let's get something very clear, Gerald," she snapped, stepping into my personal space. "You are a guest in this garage, and he's a guest in the basement. Caleb and I are updating this property to fit our lifestyle. You need to stop interfering with my home's aesthetic. You're lucky we even let you keep your old boxes down there." The contractors shifted uncomfortably, eyes finding the floor. I looked at Serena, really looked at her. I saw the entitlement radiating off her posture, the total, absolute absence of respect for the man who had financed the very ground beneath her feet. I did not argue. Arguing with arrogance is a fool's errand. I nodded, once turned my back on her, and walked away. My silence was not surrender. It was a strategic retreat. The conflict had moved beyond a physical invasion of my space into something far more dangerous. I walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the basement. The air was damp and smelled of old cardboard, a stark contrast to the sunlit home I had built above. I settled at my small desk in the corner and opened my laptop. The blue glow of the screen pushed back the shadows of my relegated room. If Serena was so certain she owned this house, I needed to see exactly how she and my son were managing what I had entrusted to them. I logged into the joint family bank accounts. I had given Caleb access years earlier to handle routine bills while I eased into retirement. I expected minor overspending, perhaps some foolish purchases, feeding Serena's endless appetite for social media perfection. What I found was a flagrant, undeniable breach. I pulled up the property tax records first. The screen loaded and bold red letters stared back at me. Delinquent. The taxes on the house had gone unpaid for 6 months. My heart began to pound a slow, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I had personally handed Caleb a cashier's check for $12,000 specifically earmarked for the county tax assessor. It was a safety net I'd put in place to ensure my son never had to lose sleep over the roof above his head. I navigated to the checking account transaction history and scrolled back through the months tracking where the money had gone. There it was. The $12,000 had never reached the county. It had been diverted, broken into hefty recurring payments, flowing straight to a luxury car dealership. Caleb was siphoning the funds I had provided to protect our home in order to cover Serena's luxury SUV lease. The sheer recklessness of it knocked the breath from me. They were risking a tax lien, gambling the very foundation of their lives for a leased vehicle with heated leather seats. I dug deeper into the statements. The financial hemorrhaging was everywhere. Thousands at high-end boutiques, obscene restaurant tabs, large withdrawals for cosmetic treatments. The money I had ground out during brutal 80-hour weeks, the funds Diane and I had built together with such care, was being torched. This was no longer about a drafting table in the garage. This was criminal negligence. My own son was burning our legacy to the ground to keep a woman happy who viewed me as nothing more than an eyesore in her aesthetic plan. I closed the laptop. The screen went dark, dropping the basement back into shadow. The time for quiet observation had passed. What I'd uncovered forced my hand immediately. I stood, grabbed my coat, and went to find my son. I needed to look Caleb in the eye and see what kind of man he had let himself become. I walked out the side door and up the driveway. Caleb was just climbing out of his brand-new, heavily financed, luxury SUV crisp designer suit leather briefcase that looked like it had never encountered an honest day's work. When he spotted me coming, his posture stiffened at once. The confident stride collapsed into the nervous shuffling of a guilty child. "Caleb," I said, stopping a few feet short of him, "we need to talk about the property taxes." Every bit of color drained from his face. He swallowed hard, eyes cutting toward the front door of the house, terrified Serena might appear. "Dad, keep your voice down," he muttered, dragging a hand across a sudden sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I can explain everything." I crossed my arms, standing firm on the concrete I had poured myself 30 years ago. "Explain to me how 6 months of taxes are delinquent when I handed you the cash to cover them. Explain to me why my money is funding a luxury car lease, while the county prepares to put a lien on this house." He fumbled, tugging at his expensive collar as if it were tightening around his throat. "Dad, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. Serena has certain needs. She has an image to maintain for her business. If I don't support her, she makes my life a living hell. We just needed to borrow the tax money temporarily. I'm going to handle it next month, I promise. You just need to adapt to Serena's needs for a little while." I stared at him, revolted. Adapt? He wanted me to adapt to his financial fraud, to smile while he put our family home at risk because he hadn't the backbone to say no to his wife. Before I could tear into his excuses, the heavy growl of a diesel engine cut us off. A gleaming luxury catering company black cargo van with logo rolled into the driveway, its tires chewing into the edge of the lawn. Two men in crisp white uniforms jumped out and threw open the rear doors, revealing towering stacks of imported delicacies. Caleb went pale, mouth hanging open. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Right on cue, Serena swept out the front door. She walked straight past me to the catering crew without so much as a glance. "Be careful with those crates," she announced loudly. "That's $15,000 worth of imported Italian marble for the patio display, and the beluga caviar needs refrigeration immediately." I looked back at Caleb. His hands were trembling. He couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. The tension in that driveway had snapped. This was no longer simple financial irresponsibility. This was active, malicious financial bleeding. They were not struggling. No difficult decisions were being made here. My money was being set ablaze right before my eyes to fund a celebration I had never been told about. My son was no innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. He was a deliberate participant in my ruin. While the caterers rolled their imported delicacies and expensive marble toward the backyard, a second vehicle glided to a stop at the curb. A sleek black town car, The door swung open and out stepped Clifford and Arlene Serena's parents, a pair of condescending snobs, who had always regarded my rough hands and practical shoes with barely concealed contempt. The driver began hauling heavy hardshell rolling trunks from the boot. The sheer volume of luggage announced a stay measured in months, not weekends. Serena flew down the walkway to meet them, wrapping herself around her mother. "Oh, I am so glad you're finally here," she squealed. "We got your rooms all ready." I stood rooted in the driveway, watching Clifford slip the driver a bill and then gesture with his cane toward my house. "What is going on, Caleb?" I asked, eyes never leaving the usurpers. Caleb recoiled, shuffling back a step. "Dad, Serena wanted to surprise you. Her parents are going to be staying with us for a while. Actually, they are permanently moving into the master bedroom. We are converting the upstairs for them." That slow, simmering tension finally boiled over. Everything snapped into focus. They were not simply brushing me aside. They were carrying out a deliberate, step-by-step erasure of my place in this house. Serena pivoted toward me, a victorious, ugly smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. She hooked her arm through her father's and looked me over like I was something that needed removing. "I hope you do not mind, Gerald," she said, coating each word in counterfeit warmth. "But since you are already so comfortable down in the basement, it just made sense. My parents need the space, and they are used to a certain standard of living." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I glanced at Clifford, who offered me a smug, dismissive tilt of his head, then at Arlene, who was already picking apart the garden with her eyes. I turned last to Caleb. He was studying the ground, every ounce of backbone drained out of him. The storm inside me was building, but I would not let them harvest my fury. I turned and walked back toward the garage, every limit I possessed having been obliterated beyond recovery. The trap was laid. They had not the faintest idea what was coming. I was at the kitchen island filling a mug with black coffee when the early light barely skimmed the granite countertops I had laid down 10 years ago. The sharp crack of something heavy hitting the marble ripped through the silence. A thick plastic bag tossed from across the island. Serena stood opposite me, arms locked across her chest, that well-practiced cold glint behind her eyes. I dropped my gaze to the black garbage bag below. The plastic was strained near to bursting. The sharp silver corner of a picture frame had torn clean through the side. It was my wedding photo. Gerald and Diane in the mountains captured in a silver-cornered frame. "What is this?" I asked. Every trace of warmth had left my voice. "Your exit strategy?" she replied, not a tremor in her tone. She planted both hands on the island and leaned toward me. "You are done here, Gerald. I am finished looking at you. I will not spend another day with you consuming the air inside my house. My parents are taking the main suite today, and they require the basement for their belongings. You are occupying square footage that belongs to my family. This is my house," I said, flat, final. She let out a laugh, short and sharp, like something breaking, and it ricocheted off the custom cabinetry. "This is Caleb's house," she fired back. "You handed it over. You quit working and turned yourself into a burden. You add nothing to the aesthetic, nothing to the lifestyle, and not a single thing to my future." I held my gaze on the bag. I thought about 4 decades bent over commercial blueprints, reading load-bearing walls, calculating the structural tolerances of downtown skyscrapers. All of it so my son would never go hungry, never feel the weight of real hardship. I had signed this property over to give him a foundation in life. I believed I was protecting him. What I had actually done was hand the front door key to someone who would use it to lock me out. She slid the bag toward me. Inside, the glass over Diane's face cracked with a hollow, nauseating crunch. "Take your junk and clear out," Serena ordered. "I want you gone before my parents come downstairs. They should not have to sit through breakfast looking at a squatter. You have bled my husband dry for long enough." The impulse to erupt clawed at the base of my throat. I could have catalogued every tile, every fixture, every structural beam in that house, and told her exactly whose labor had paid for it. I could have made her understand that the lavish life she clung to was nothing but a paper tower propped up by my quiet sacrifice. But when you show your hand in anger, your opponent already knows how to beat you. I studied the shards of glass pressing through the plastic. Diane used to say, "Watch what a person does with their hands, not what they do with their mouth." Serena's hands were clamped around the marble-edged knuckles, white squeezing hard. She was desperate for a reaction, something she could twist into victimhood in front of Caleb. I would not oblige her. "Where is Caleb?" I asked. Nothing more than a reconnaissance question. Caleb is sleeping, she shot back, too fast. He agrees with me. We talked the whole night through. You are a weight dragging down his mental health. You think he owes you care in your old age, but we have our own future to build. My parents actually elevate our standing. You just sit there passing judgment on everything we do. I reached over and lifted the garbage bag off the counter. It felt like an insult given physical form, a few flannel shirts, a pair of slacks, and the last tangible remnants of the woman I had loved. 30 pounds of plastic and broken glass. Yes, my entire history in this house discarded. He agrees with this, I said again, leaving the words to settle in the air. He begged me to be the one to tell you. Serena was lying. I had known my son his entire life. He was coiled upstairs beneath the covers, while his wife delivered the verdict, too gutless to face my eyes, yet thoroughly complicit in everything she was doing. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate the driveway, Serena announced, fishing her phone from her pocket. If my parents find you here when they come down, I am calling the police and reporting you for trespassing. I will tell them you turned aggressive. Who do you think they will side with, a successful young woman or a homeless old man? The nerve of it was almost something to marvel at. She was utterly certain she was holding every card in the deck. What she saw was a worn-out old man in a faded sweater. She could not see the architect who had engineered the very walls that made her feel untouchable. She could not grasp that the man who laid the foundation is also the one who knows precisely where it gives way. I said nothing. Not one tear for the son I had buried in my heart, not one for the home I was being driven from. Tears are wasted on a burning building. I wrapped my fingers around the torn plastic, the fractured edge of Diane's. 5 minutes, I said barely above a whisper. I stepped back from the island. I did not let my eyes linger on the crown molding I had chosen piece by piece. I did not spare a glance for the espresso machine my earnings had paid for. I moved in a straight line down the hallway toward the front door. Leave the spare keys on the console, Serena called behind me, her voice thick with the pleasure of it. And do not bother trying to reach Caleb. I'm having your number blocked on his phone. You are dead to us, Gerald. I stopped at the console table in the entryway, reached into my pocket, set the brass key down on the polished surface without ceremony. The quiet clink of it seemed to fill the whole foyer. I held my eyes on it for just a breath. That key had once opened something real. Now it was an artifact from a family that had eaten itself hollow. I pressed the heavy oak door open. Freezing rain struck my face cold, immediate, honest. I walked out onto the porch with the garbage bag hanging from my bleeding hand. Behind me, the door shut hard, decisive, final. The deadbolt drove home with a click that rang like a period at the end of a sentence. I stood alone on the rain-soaked concrete. In seconds, my jacket was saturated, but the cold never reached me. What I felt instead was a clear, terrifying sense of purpose. Serena believed she had ended things by casting me into the storm. She had only just set me free. I pulled my gaze from Serena. She had never been the root of this. She was the weed that grows when the soil goes untended. The rot began with my son. I looked straight at Caleb. He filled the arched kitchen doorway, 35 years old, a man I had taught to ride a bicycle on this very street, taught to swing a hammer when we framed the patio together, taught to meet another man's gaze when speaking. Now he couldn't lift his chin off his chest. His eyes were pinned to the imported hardwood floor. His shoulders rolled forward inside his expensive tailored suit. The silence in the kitchen swelled. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight. I waited for him to speak. I waited for the boy I had raised to step up and defend his father. I waited for him to tell his wife that casting a 68-year-old man into the street was something he would not allow. Instead, he shifted his weight between his feet and rubbed the back of his neck. The graduation watch on his wrist caught the recessed lighting. The luxury college graduation watch Gerald bought for Caleb, meant to mark time well spent, and a future rich with possibility. Now that same hand was being used to shield his face. Serena folded her arms and fixed her stare on him. "Tell him, Caleb," she ordered. "Tell him we agreed on this. Tell him it is time for him to leave." Caleb finally raised his head. His face was drained of color and sheened with perspiration. He had the look of an animal with nowhere to run. His eyes swept the refrigerator, the marble countertops, the garbage bag sitting between us, anywhere that was not my face. "Dad," he began. The voice that came out was thin and unsteady. It was not a man's voice. It was the voice of a coward. Dad, we are under a lot of pressure right now. Serena's parents are accustomed to a certain standard of living. They need the guest rooms. They need the basement for their private storage. We are trying to build a modern life here. He swallowed his throat, visibly tightening. It really is for the best. You moving out is for the best. You can find a nice, quiet apartment closer to the city. You will be happier there. We just need room to breathe. Those words drifted through the cold kitchen air and dissolved. He was expelling his own father to placate a woman consumed by aesthetics and her imperious parents. He was trading his flesh and blood for the illusion of a perfect household. A lesser man would have buckled. A weaker father would have wept. I could have reminded him that I held the mortgage he slept under every night. I could have recited the legal facts of ownership until the walls shook. But an argument only hands them a stage. Begging only fattens their sense of power. Silence cuts far deeper than either. I shut my mouth. I let the quiet of the room do its work. I watched the guilt move across his pale face like weather. I watched him physically contract beneath the pressure of my steady, unblinking gaze. I did not release him with a fight. I did not furnish Serena with the scene she had been rehearsing for. I simply reached across and closed my hand around the black plastic bag. The jagged silver corner of Diane's broken picture frame drove through the plastic and into the flesh of my palm. I welcomed the sting. Physical pain is clarifying. It anchors you in what is real. My wife was gone. My son was beyond reach. The enemy occupied my kitchen. I turned my back on my only child and walked out of the kitchen with deliberate, measured steps. No rushing. I would not give them the image of a man in flight. I moved down the main hallway, its walls hung with expensive art Serena had acquired using the money I earmarked for property taxes. The hypocrisy decorated every surface. I reached the heavy oak front door, took it by the brass handle with my good hand, and pulled it open. Freezing autumn rain drove straight into my face. The wind poured through the open doorway and cut through to the bone. I stepped onto the covered porch without pausing, without a backward glance, without a parting word. I pulled the door shut. The wood met the frame with a loud, conclusive crack. An instant later, the deadbolt snapped home. Serena had thrown the lock before I cleared the threshold. That sound, the bolt sliding into the keep, was the last thread severing. I was no longer a father standing in his own home. I was a man who had been cornered and disposed of. I stood alone on the wet concrete. The rain hammered the porch steps. Cold pushed through my thin cotton sweater almost immediately. The water rinsed the thin smear of blood from my palm. I started down the driveway, and with each step away from the house, my resolve hardened into something dense and immovable. I had no car. Serena had positioned her vehicle directly behind my old sedan, boxing it in completely. I was leaving on foot. I walked out into the suburban street. As the storm built around me, the streetlights flickering beneath low, swollen clouds. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the cold edge of my debit card. I needed shelter. I needed a base from which to organize my response. 2 miles down the road sat a small motel with a buzzing neon sign. I walked toward it through the downpour. I entered the lobby, soaked through, and laid my card on the counter. The clerk ran it. He frowned and ran it again. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly. "It's declining." My stomach dropped. Being physically removed from my home was only the opening move. The survival conflict had just locked its jaws around me. The autumn rain turned the sidewalks into cold, slick channels. I walked with my head angled down, into the wind, the plastic garbage bag dragging against my leg like ballast. My leather shoes, built for dry drafting rooms and carpeted offices, were soaked through inside 3 blocks. Every step drove a dull ache up through my shins, a blunt reminder of 68 years of living. I did not stop. I did not allow myself a single glance back toward the warm lit windows of the house I had paid for. I kept my gaze locked on the dim red glow pulsing ahead in the rain. The Ridgecrest Motel was a weathered cinder block building squatting at the edge of the county line, a place for transients and miscalculations. Tonight, it was my only option. I shouldered through the glass lobby door. A rusted bell gave a weak chime overhead. The air inside was thick with stale bleach and the ghost of old cigarette smoke. A young clerk with exhausted eyes glanced up from his phone. He took in the soaked sweater, the dripping hair, the torn black garbage bag hanging from my bleeding hand. His expression arranged itself into the polite blankness of someone preparing to say no. He saw a vagrant. He saw a problem to be redirected. I stepped to the laminate counter and drew my wallet from my damp pocket. I need a single room for the night, I told him, keeping my voice level stripped of the humiliation scorching beneath it. Just one night. The clerk exhaled slowly and punched at his ancient keyboard. That will be $85 plus a $50 incidental hold. He muttered, eyes on the screen. Card only. No cash deposits for walk-ins. I produced my primary bank debit card, the everyday account, separate from the guarded trusts, and set it on the counter. He swiped it through the magnetic reader and waited. The machine hummed a moment and then released a sharp, flat beep. He pressed a button and tried again. Declined, he said, sliding the card back across the counter without ceremony. I looked at the card, then at him. That is not possible, I said quietly. There is well over $15,000 in that account. Please run it once more. The chip reader may be wet from the rain. The clerk's irritation was visible. He snatched the card back, wiped it across his uniform shirt, and pressed it into the chip reader. The screen blinked. The same harsh beep followed. Declined, he repeated louder, this time with a clear edge of finality. Look, I cannot issue a room without a valid card. You'll need to step aside. I stared at the blinking red light on the terminal. A deep primal alarm began sounding somewhere in the back of my mind. Being thrown out of the house had been emotional violence. A card declining was something else entirely, a mechanical impossibility. I didn't debate it with the clerk. I took the card, gathered my garbage bag, and walked back out through the glass doors. I stood beneath the narrow concrete awning of the motel, shaking hard as the freezing rain beat against the parking lot. I fished my phone from my coat pocket. The screen was slicked with water, but still responsive. I opened my banking application. The loading circle spun uselessly in the weak weather signal. I closed it and dialed the 24-hour customer service number from the back of the card instead. An automated system walked me through a chain of security prompts. I entered my social security number, date of birth, and secure PIN. The robotic voice eventually arrived at the account summary. Your current available balance is $42.50. I stopped breathing. The freezing wind tearing under that awning seemed to disappear entirely. I stood suspended in a pocket of absolute disbelief. Negative $42. I hammered the zero key until the line clicked over to a human. A woman answered, bright, cheerful voice, completely incongruous with the wreckage I was standing in the middle of. I gave her my security details and demanded an immediate accounting of why my primary checking balance had been wiped to nothing. She typed for a moment. Sir, she said, her tone adjusting to something more careful. It appears a wire transfer was initiated this morning at 8:15 a.m. A total of $15,000 was moved from your primary checking to an external account. I gripped the phone until my knuckles ached. Who initiated the transfer? My voice came out hollow and scraped raw. I did not authorize any movement of funds today. More typing. The transfer was authorized and executed by Serena Hargrove, she said evenly. She is listed as an authorized user with full transactional privileges on this specific account. The memory arrived like a blow to the chest. 3 years earlier, I had suffered a mild cardiac event. I spent a week in the hospital under observation and stress tests. Caleb had been across the country on a corporate retreat, completely out of reach. Serena had stepped into the gap, arriving at my hospital room, bringing terrible cafeteria coffee, playing the devoted daughter-in-law with practiced ease. I had been heavily medicated, anxious about the mounting medical copays and the household bills stacking up at home. I had signed the paperwork to add her as an authorized user on my daily checking account, giving her the ability to pay the hospital and cover my utilities if I couldn't do it myself. I never took her name off. I never revoked the access. I had made the catastrophic assumption that the woman my only son had married would operate with some minimum level of family loyalty. I asked the representative where the wire had gone. I needed to hear the last irrefutable fact spoken aloud. The funds were wired directly to a limited liability company registered under the name Prestige Event Planners. She read from her screen. The transaction notes state housewarming gala payment in full. I ended the call. I lowered the phone. I was standing in the freezing rain with a plastic bag full of broken picture frames and damp clothing while Serena stood inside the house I built, hosting an extravagant party paid for with money she had just lifted directly from my account. She hadn't merely evicted me, she had bled me dry with deliberate precision to guarantee I had no footing left to stand on. Her intent was to leave me stranded in the storm, powerless, isolated, finished. The shivering in my limbs stopped. The bone-deep chill of the autumn rain burned away, replaced by a white-hot, searing lucidity. Serena and Caleb believed they had neutralized me completely. They assumed that emptying my checking account had cut the wires to my ability to fight. They saw a retired man living quietly on a modest income, and mistook that frugality, that deliberate low profile, for weakness. They knew nothing of the shadow assets. They had no awareness of the vast airtight blind trusts I had established decades earlier to insulate my true commercial wealth from precisely this category of predatory attack. They had taken $15,000 from my pocket. They had absolutely no idea that they were sleeping inside a multi-million-dollar property that sat entirely in my name. The eviction and the theft taken together forged something new and terrifying, a fresh reality. I was no longer a father attempting to reason with a misguided son. I was an architect staring at a structure riddled with rot. And an architect understands exactly which load-bearing pillars to shatter, to bring the entire edifice crashing to the ground. I turned my collar up into the wind and started the long walk toward the city center. The period of a silent endurance was finished. The careful, methodical construction of their total ruin had begun. The rain came down in heavy sheets as I moved away from the motel parking lot. My leather shoes, designed for dry carpeted offices and drafting rooms, were saturated and heavy within 3 blocks. Each step pushed a dull ache up through my knees and into my lower back. The wind funneled straight down the empty suburban highway, driving through my thin sweater as if it weren't there. Serena and Caleb had fully expected this storm to do their work for them. They had calculated that the weather and the empty account together would fracture whatever remained of my resolve. They imagined a man of 68, stripped of cash and pitched into the brutal cold, would eventually panic and find his way back to their front porch to beg for a corner of the basement on their degrading terms. They were profoundly wrong. I kept my head angled into the wind and held a steady pace along the dark shoulder of the road. I concentrated on the controlled rhythm of my breathing. Panic is a luxury that belongs to people who never learned to build anything that had to hold. I was a master commercial architect. I had spent my working life designing massive industrial structures engineered to survive earthquakes and hurricane-force winds. I knew precisely how to reinforce a wall on the verge of collapse, and I knew with equal precision how to execute a controlled and devastating demolition. A mile along the desolate highway, a flickering yellow sign cut through the darkness. A truck stop diner open 24 hours. The cracked asphalt lot was empty except for a single rusted pickup idling near the back. I pushed through the heavy glass entrance door. Warm air struck my face like a wall. The smell of dark roasted coffee and frying grease filled my lungs immediately. A waitress with deep, tired eyes glanced up from the counter. I asked for a booth at the back and a large thermos of black coffee brought by the waitress. She gave a slow nod and reached for a laminated menu. I told her to keep the menu. I only needed the coffee and a quiet table. I made my way to the furthest booth, tucked into the back corner of the diner. The faded red vinyl seats were patched in silver tape. I sat down and set the torn garbage bag on the bench across from me. My right hand still throbbed steadily where the broken glass from Diane's picture frame had cut into the palm. I took a rough paper napkin from the metal dispenser and wound it tightly around the wound. The waitress arrived and set down a heavy ceramic mug alongside a steaming pot. I thanked her quietly. I folded both hands around the hot mug and held on, letting the warmth work its way into my aching bones. I reached into my damp coat pocket and drew out my phone. The screen was filmed with rainwater. I cleaned it against a dry patch on the inside lining of my sweater. My daily checking account was gutted. Serena had stripped out the $15,000 to pay for her imported marble and her extravagant catering order. She was certain she had taken everything I owned. She believed she had severed my last financial lifeline and left me with nothing to work with. I opened a secure browser. I moved straight past my standard consumer banking applications without stopping. Into the address bar, I entered a complex string of randomized characters, numbers and letters that existed in no password manager and no document that could be found. A plain gray login screen appeared. No bank logo, no corporate branding, no identifying marks of any kind. It was a highly secured cloud server administered directly by a private wealth management firm located downtown. I entered my credentials. A dual authentication prompt appeared immediately. I confirmed my identity through an encrypted application sequence. The secure screen loaded. $4.2 million. The figure appeared in crisp black numerals against the glowing screen. $4,200,000 spread quietly across a diversified portfolio of tax-free municipal bonds and dependable blue-chip stocks. The shadow asset. Serena and Caleb had me pegged as an exhausted old draftsman scraping by on a modest fixed income and Social Security checks. Neither of them had the faintest clue that I'd spent 35 years putting my name on massive corporate headquarters and sprawling industrial complexes. Every substantial commission check I'd ever cashed had been quietly routed into a blind trust. Diane and I made that decision early, practically before the ink on our marriage certificate had dried. Visible wealth, we agreed, does two things. It poisons children with entitlement, and it draws predators, like blood draws sharks. So we kept a sensible, modest, suburban house. We drove ordinary, reliable cars. We raised our son with the firm belief that a man builds his own worth through hard manual work. We wanted him to construct his empire with his own hands. I scrolled further down the screen and pulled up the real estate holdings section. The property documents arranged themselves in a clean column. Right at the top sat the house Caleb and Serena were living in at that very moment. Caleb liked nothing more than dropping the word homeowner around his pretentious circle. Serena savored every opportunity to boast to her smug parents about the grand estate she personally commanded, a beautiful brittle delusion shared by both of them. The deed carried neither of their names. That house and every inch of the double lot beneath it existed inside a revocable living trust. I was its sole trustee. Every legal right attached to that property ran through me and no one else. I could put it on the market tomorrow. I could bring in a demolition crew. I could strip away the lawn and pave the whole parcel for commercial use. Caleb held titles to nothing beyond whatever hung in his wardrobe. I lifted the cup and drank slowly, deliberately. The coffee was hot and bitter, and the burn at the back of my throat felt like clarity. The raw, wounded feeling their betrayal had carved into me, it was draining away. Something colder and more useful was settling in its place. The transformation was complete. The man who had endured their contempt in silence was gone. What remained was an architect, not of buildings now, but of consequences, sketching out a precise and merciless blueprint. They had assembled their entire counterfeit life on the assumption that I would never act. Serena had treated me like an inconvenient squatter, fouling up her floor plan. Caleb had handled me like an embarrassing liability to be kept out of sight, stored in the basement, away from his curated world. They'd gone further than humiliation. They recruited an audience, hauled Clifford and Arlene into my home to stand in my place and bury whatever trace of me remained. They burned through $15,000 of my money, throwing a celebration for their oblivious, self-congratulating friends. When they crossed that line, they crossed the last one available to them. I opened a heavily encrypted document folder on my phone. Inside sat the contact details for my estate attorney. Mr. Stratton was nothing like the soft, conciliatory lawyers people hire to draw up wills at the kitchen table. He was a corporate litigator, precise, unsentimental, and genuinely dangerous in a courtroom. I kept him on a substantial annual retainer, specifically so the structures protecting my assets stayed watertight and unassailable. My standing instruction to him had always been simple: stay invisible until I need you to strike. I needed that precision now. The trap was nearly set, and I required him to spring it. I glanced at the phone's clock. Just past 3 noir in the morning. Mr. Stratton would be at that mahogany desk of his by 6. 3 hours to arrange every piece in the right sequence. I called up a notepad and typed with my good hand, working through the steps methodically. First, cut off any residual utility accounts still in my name that they were drawing from. Second, commission a full legal audit of the property to catalog each unauthorized structural change Serena had pushed through. Third, a buyer. That last step had one obvious answer. Beckett Hollis was a commercial real estate developer who played without sentiment or hesitation. His firm had put up roughly half the shopping centers spread across the county. For 10 solid years, he had been circling my double-lot property, making offer after offer, each one substantial. What he wanted was to reduce the existing house to rubble and replace it with a high-density cluster of luxury townhomes. I'd turned him away every time. The reason had been sentimental. I wanted to preserve those rooms for Caleb, wanted his future children to grow up in the same space as he had. That reasoning belonged to a different man. The house was not a home anymore. It was a weapon, and I intended to use it. Beckett kept his capital liquid and his decisions fast. He didn't tolerate unnecessary delays or bureaucratic friction. A slight discount in exchange for an immediate, all-cash close. He would cut through every inspection, every formality, every standard waiting period to take possession. The deed would be in his holding company's hands before anyone in that house had finished their morning coffee. I set the cup down and let the silence of the truck stop diners settle around me. The only sound was the low, steady hum drifting out of the kitchen refrigerators. I let myself picture Serena in that marble kitchen snapping orders at her expensive caterers, imperious and untouchable. I pictured Clifford and Arlene pulling their heavy, hard-shell, rolling trunks through the door of the master bedroom, the one that had been Diane's, sleeping peacefully, deeply comfortable under my roof. No doubt they all imagined the old man beaten somewhere cold, crumpled under a highway overpass, finished. I composed a message to Mr. Stratton. Terse, direct, clear, your morning schedule entirely. We are executing an emergency asset liquidation at first light. I pressed send. The message was gone. I stared at the torn garbage bag propped on the seat across from me, its contents a record of everything they'd thrown away. Diane had loved that house with her whole heart. She was the one who had planted the great elm tree that still stood in the front yard. But Diane was gone, and the son we had given everything to had made his choice. He had chosen to become exactly the kind of person we had spent his entire childhood trying to protect him from becoming. The structure had to go. I placed my phone face down on the table. I pressed my back against the hard booth and let stillness take over. I had infinite patience. Dawn was coming, and when the sun cleared the horizon, it would bring with it the legal dismantling of everything my ungrateful son and his arrogant wife believed they owned. The city was still drowned in pre-dawn gray when I arrived at the polished mahogany doors of Stratton's office building. My fist was tight around my battered briefcase knuckles drained of color. A man in my condition, damp clothes, hollow eyes, no business being in this district, should have been turned away at the door. My clothes were damp, my skin was cold, but my resolve had the density of stone. To any observer, I was out of place. Yet the only individual who could excise the rot from my life waited somewhere above me in that building. The security guard behind the lobby desk assessed me with undisguised contempt when I requested the executive suite. I offered no explanation. From my jacket I produced a laminated card and held it to the reader. The guard's expression shifted the moment he registered what he was looking at the access credentials of a legacy client. The elevator exhaled a soft chime as the doors parted, and I ascended toward the quiet floor above. Mr. Stratton was not a man who wasted mornings. He was already behind his desk when I pushed through into his office. He registered neither surprise at my arrival nor at the condition I was in. He simply set aside the thick file open in front of him and indicated the leather chair across from his desk. "Gerald," he said, in that clipped, arid voice, dry as paper tearing. "I assume this is not a social call?" I didn't take the chair. I set the garbage bag down on his immaculate carpet and stood facing him still as carved stone. "I am not Gerald, the father tonight," I said. "I am Gerald the architect, and the trust is currently compromised." Something sharp moved behind Stratton's eyes. He came forward in his seat, fingers pressed together at the tips. "I have been expecting a breach of this magnitude for some time. Tell me what they have done." I walked him through it, measured, methodical, leaving nothing out. The eviction from the garage, the $15,000 drained from my checking account to bankroll their lavish performance for their friends, and the forged signature on the home equity line of credit executed behind my back to keep their lifestyle propped up and running. Every sentence I delivered dropped the temperature in that room another degree. Stratton reached behind a panel, built into his desk and drew out the original master files of the Hargrove estate. The pages carried the weight of decades in every sheet. He moved through them at speed, eyes tracking the legal clauses that had been set down long before Caleb had any conception of what greed even was. "We need to be absolutely certain of the damage," he said almost to himself. He angled the computer monitor so I could read the records on his screen. And there it was. The house where Caleb and Serena were sleeping sat right at the very top of the trust. It was a Hargrove family asset, but it belonged to neither of them in any legal sense. Every thread of ownership ran through a revocable living trust, and every thread of that trust ran through me. Mr. Stratton began reading the fine print aloud, his measured voice filling the room with the cold weight of statutory reality. "Your son and his wife have committed clear and actionable bank fraud. Gerald, they forged your signature on a $200,000 equity loan. This goes well beyond a breach of trust. This is a federal crime. If we bring this to the authorities right now, eviction will be the least of their problems. They will be facing felony charges and the very real possibility of prison time." I watched those words settle into the walls of the room. The surge of satisfaction I'd half expected never came. What I felt instead was a cold professional clarity, the particular calm of a man who has finally located the load-bearing wall he intends to bring down. This was the blueprint reaching its finished form. "We need a buyer," Stratton said, peering at me over the rim of his glasses. "We liquidate this before the bank gets involved and starts pulling your name into their proceedings." "I already have one," I said. I found Beckett's number on my phone. "He's been trying to tear this property down for years. One call, and he'll be here within the hour, capital in hand, and ready to close." Stratton gave a slow nod. "A clean cash sale eliminates any legal mechanism they could use to delay the eviction. They'll have no recourse." I dialed. The line connected. My voice came out steady, measured, free of any tremor. "Beckett, I'm ready to sell, and I want this closed before sunset today." The pause on his end lasted no more than a heartbeat before his response came back, charged with barely contained excitement. "I'll have my team at your door in 30 minutes, Gerald. Don't move." I ended the call. There was no going back now. I turned to Stratton. "Freeze Serena's accounts on the fraud grounds and get the deed transfer drawn up. This property is no longer a home. It's a demolition site." We worked straight through. The sun crept above the skyline and began bleeding orange and gold across the office. Each document was another precise blow against the tower of arrogance they'd constructed. When the final signatures landed on the deed transfer, something eased inside my chest. Not relief exactly. Something quieter and more permanent. The property was sold. Every asset of mine sat locked away in a separate structure Serena could never reach. Caleb and Serena were up there right now, hosting their extravagant gathering, directly above the wreckage of their own futures. They imagined themselves the architects of their own destiny. They were tenants, nothing more, and the wrecking ball had already been ordered. I was the one who ordered it. The mechanism was primed. Their total ruin had a countdown attached to it now. Mr. Stratton sat studying his glowing monitor. The only sound in the large office was the dry, rhythmic clicking of his mouse. I watched his reflection move in the dark glass of the corner window, while the city outside slowly stirred to life. Inside this room, the air felt airless and still. Stratton stopped clicking. He pressed closer to the screen eyes, narrowing to a sharp focus. He said nothing. He tapped a key, and the laser printer in the corner woke with a low mechanical hum. When a lawyer of his caliber goes silent and reaches for the printer, you do not interrupt. You simply wait. I sat motionless and waited. He crossed to the tray and lifted a thick, warm stack of pages. He carried them back to the mahogany desk and laid them flat, running one finger down the columns of dense figures. Then he looked up at me. His face held no readable emotion whatsoever. "Gerald," he said, keeping his voice low, "were you aware that your primary residence is currently carrying a substantial financial lien?" I stared at him. The sentence refused to arrange itself into anything coherent. "I paid cash for that property 30 years ago. There was no mortgage, no outstanding obligation of any kind. The whole estate sat inside the blind trust untouched." Stratton rotated one of the printed sheets and slid it across the desk toward me, pressing his fingertip to a specific line of bold text. "According to the county registry, A home equity line of credit was opened 8 months ago. $200,000. The collateral securing that loan was the physical property itself. I stared at the number. $200,000. The weight of it settled over me like something dense and airless being lowered onto my chest. Serena hadn't merely been siphoning my checking account for groceries and cosmetic indulgences. She and Caleb had taken a mortgage out against the very ground I was standing on. They'd leveraged the walls I built, the structure I designed, and paid for to finance a fabricated existence. I am the sole legal trustee, I said. My voice stayed dangerously even. No bank with any legitimate standing would process a loan of that size against a trust property without my physical presence and a notarized signature from my own hand. Stratton nodded. He turned the monitor to face me directly. That is precisely what elevates this beyond a family matter, he said. Look at the digital scan of the original loan origination document. I leaned toward the screen. A standard commercial lending contract from a major national bank filled the display. At the bottom on the line reserved for the primary trustee was my signature, my full name rendered in cursive, but the hand that wrote it was not mine. The loops were hurried. The pressure across the strokes was erratic. It was a crude and careless imitation. Serena forged my name, I said. Stratton shook his head. He zoomed in on the secondary signature, the one required to authorize the final dispersal of funds. It wasn't Serena. It was Caleb. I looked at my son's name, Caleb Hargrove, written out in the same flowing cursive I had personally guided him through at the age of 7. I could still see it, the two of us at the kitchen table, his small hand wrapped around a yellow pencil, my hand steadying his while I walked him through every letter. I had given him that signature as a tool, something to carry him through the front door of adult life with confidence and his own identity. He had taken that same hand, those same letters I shaped for him, and turned them into an instrument of fraud against me. He's listed as the primary beneficiary on the dispersal account, Stratton said. The bank wired the full $200,000 directly into a private checking account held jointly by Caleb and Serena. I've pulled the complete routing history. Where did it go? I asked. Stratton drew another sheet from the stack. Everywhere. $70,000 went straight to a luxury car dealership, 2 high-end vehicle leases paid off outright. $40,000 went to imported designer furniture retailers. $25,000 was routed to an exclusive cosmetic surgery clinic downtown. The remainder hemorrhaged across luxury catering, designer clothing, and tropical vacations. They had burned through $250,000 in under 12 months. The account was barely breathing. Everything snapped into focus at once. The luxury catering company's black cargo van idling in the driveway, the imported Italian marbles stacked across my patio, the smug, entitled expressions on Serena's parents' faces as they hauled their heavy, hard-shell rolling trunks into my home. Every piece of it purchased with equity stolen from beneath my feet. Caleb was not merely a weak man sheltering behind his domineering wife. He was a deliberate and active participant in my destruction. He had willingly bartered his own character to sustain a performance for people who held him in private contempt. I turned away from the monitor. The morning sun had cleared the horizon and was pressing flat white light across the city below. Whatever residual anger I had been carrying, gone. Whatever grief I'd held for the father I used to be to that man, gone. The deep biological instinct that had protected Caleb his entire life simply ceased. No fade, no struggle, a clean and total severance. I felt nothing. What are the specific legal implications? I asked. Stratton leaned back in his chair, removed his reading glasses, and folded them with deliberate care. He looked at me steadily. Gerald, this is not a civil disagreement over unauthorized renovations. This is federal bank fraud, wire fraud, grand theft, identity theft. The moment we notify the bank that your signature is fraudulent, they will freeze the account and they will contact the federal authorities immediately. The FBI handles fraud at this scale. Stratton paused. He let the silence hold its shape in the room. Once I make this call, there is no path back, he continued. We cannot resolve this quietly between counsel over a conference table. The bank will demand recovery of what was taken. Federal prosecutors will move toward arrest. Your son will not simply lose the house. He would be facing a mandatory minimum sentence inside a federal penitentiary. His professional life would be ash. Everything he currently called his existence would cease before the day was out. Stratton studied my face with the careful attention of a man waiting for the familiar tremor of parental instinct to surface. He was extending the easy exit. The standard offer: protect the bloodline, absorb the damage, keep the family name out of federal records. Plenty of wealthy fathers would have seized that path without hesitation. They would have quietly swallowed the debt, written the check, and buried the crime beneath a blanket of unconditional love, rather than watch their child disappear into a prison. Caleb had built his entire scheme on that assumption. He had wagered everything on the near certainty that I would eventually uncover the fraud and then, faced with the alternative, choose to protect him. He had turned my love into a liability. He had read my loyalty as a structural weakness, something to be loaded down until it buckled. He was convinced a father couldn't pull the trigger on his own son. He had badly misjudged his father. I thought about the freezing rain on my face, the heavy oak door closing, the brass deadbolt thrown against the storm, Serena pressing that torn garbage bag into my hands, Diane's broken wedding glass inside, Caleb standing there staring at the floor rather than watch me go too gutless to witness what he'd done. They had dismantled every reason I might have had to protect them. "Initiate the fraud alert," I said. My voice didn't waver. It came out flat and certain. Stratton raised an eyebrow. "Are you absolutely certain, Gerald? This is the definitive point of no return." "Make the call," I told him. "Contact the bank right now. Forward the sworn fraud affidavit to their senior legal department. Inform them that the sole trustee of the Hargrove estate has formally identified a fraudulent $200,000 encumbrance against the property. Give them my sworn statement confirming I did not authorize or execute those loan documents." Stratton nodded. A grim satisfaction settled across his face, restrained, professional, precise. "I'll draft the affidavit immediately and route the complete transaction history to the National Fraud Division. The bank will call the loan due in full today. When Caleb can't produce the $200,000, the case moves automatically to the federal prosecutor. I want the property liquidated at the same time," I said. "Get Beckett on the line. Tell him I'm accepting his standing cash offer for the full lot. The only condition is that the deed transfers no later than $200 this afternoon. The moment the ink is dry, he can bring his demolition crew in." Stratton reached for the desk phone and began dialing the fraud division of the National Bank. I settled back into the leather chair and watched him work. An extraordinary lightness moved through me. The weight of fatherhood, that old consuming biological obligation, had lifted clean off my shoulders. I owed Caleb nothing. For 35 years I had laid a foundation beneath him solid and wide and built from everything I had. He had chosen to take a sledgehammer to it. Now he would live in what remained. The trap was armed on every front. The federal inquiry would be open within the hour. The debt would hit them like a wall they couldn't see coming. The cash sale would strip the roof from over their heads before sunset. They believed they had fortified their position. In reality, they had sealed themselves inside a structure that was already burning. I sat with my eyes closed and listened to Stratton reciting the details of the crime to the bank's fraud department. It was the sound of a mechanism working exactly as designed. Stratton returned the receiver to its cradle with the measured care of a man completing a ritual. The call to the National Bank's Federal Fraud Division was done. Deep inside the banking system, a silent alarm was now active. The machinery of consequence had begun to move. Now came the physical piece of the plan. I reached into my damp coat pocket and drew out my phone. My thumb paused over the contacts list for just a moment before I pulled up the name I had been deliberately avoiding for 10 years, Beckett Hollis. Beckett was not a man who appreciated architecture, not in any meaningful sense. He had no feel for the sweep of a vaulted ceiling or the way structural proportion could make a space feel alive. What Beckett understood was poured concrete and margin. For 10 solid years he had pursued my property with the patience of something that never stops moving. The double lot sat squarely at the center of a neighborhood the city had been remaking from the ground up. 5 years ago, the council had completely rezoned the entire area to permit high-density, luxury construction. Every parcel on that street had since been consumed by towers of luxury townhomes. My property was the last wide holdout, and Beckett had called me every single quarter, with an escalating offer to change that. Every time I refused. I used to tell him that Diane had planted the great elm tree, standing in that front yard with her own hands. I told him I was holding the house intact for Caleb, so his children, when they came, could take their first steps in the same rooms he had. That sentiment was dead now, dead and cold. I pressed call, 3 rings. Then a gruff, impatient voice came through the line, Beckett, who had no use for pleasantries, especially not before sunrise. He wanted to know who was calling his private number at this hour. I told him it was Gerald Hargrove. The line went quiet. I could make out the distant sound of traffic. He was already somewhere in the city, already in motion. Then he gave a sharp, contemptuous laugh. He asked whether the stubborn old man had finally gone soft, or whether I was just calling to gripe about the noise from his latest project down the street. I didn't engage with it. The double lot is for sale, I said. The silence that followed had a different quality. Beckett was a predator, and predators go still when the opportunity materializes. He asked what disaster had finally cracked a decade of refusal. I told him the sentimental value attached to that property had expired during the night. I told him I had looked at the blueprints of what I'd built and seen that the foundation was rotten beyond recovery. He asked my price. He braced himself for a prolonged fight, expected me to wring every dollar the current market would bear from his firm. Instead, I cut straight beneath his defenses. I offered him the full estate at a flat 30% discount, below the current appraisal. A sharp breath crossed the line. Even Beckett, a man who measured everything in yield, recognized something wrong with a number that good. He asked what was buried in it. Contaminated soil, maybe, or a quiet condemnation order from the city. I told him the property was in perfect condition, and the title was entirely clean. The terms I explained were logistical, not negotiable, not flexible. Cash only. No financing, no drawn-out inspection window, no extended escrow. The deed had to land in his holding company's name by 2:00 this afternoon, and there was one additional physical requirement before the contract was binding. His demolition crew had to be on site the moment the paperwork was executed. Beckett let out a low, slow whistle. He told me a same-day cash close of that scale was a serious undertaking, even for an operation as liquid as his. He wanted to know why I was in such a driven rush to bring down my own family home. I gave him no emotional narrative. I gave him the plain facts, nothing more. I told him the people currently living in that house had committed substantial financial fraud against my accounts. My own son had forged my signature to extract $200,000 and spend it maintaining a fiction. The federal authorities were already processing the bank fraud, but I wanted the physical shelter pulled out from under them before dark. Beckett laughed again. This time there was no warmth in it at all, just the hard recognizing sound of one ruthless operator acknowledging another. He told me he had no interest in my family's internal wreckage. What he cared about was the land beneath the structure. He said his corporate attorneys would need to coordinate directly with my legal team to push through the title transfer and route around the standard municipal waiting periods. I looked across the desk at Stratton. He was already pulling the necessary transfer deeds from his secured filing cabinet. I told Beckett my estate attorney was seated directly in front of me and the paperwork was actively being drawn up. Beckett formally accepted the terms. He committed to wiring the liquid funds into Stratton's protected trust account by noon. His legal team would be standing by to execute the digital signatures. Then his voice dropped an octave. He issued a specific warning. His primary demolition foreman, he told me, was not a man who observed social niceties. If I authorized arrival at 2:00, they would not knock politely and give the current occupants time to gather their things. They would come with heavy diesel machinery and full legal authority. They would start pulling down exterior walls, regardless of who was weeping in the living room or what celebration was being assembled inside. A deep, settled calm moved through my entire body. I told Beckett that was precisely the standard of service I was paying for. I wanted the heavy equipment. I wanted the sound of timber splintering apart. I wanted Caleb and Serena to feel the physical consequences of their arrogance trembling up through the floorboards beneath them. I told him to instruct his crew to proceed without any mercy whatsoever. I ended the call and laid the phone face down on the polished desk. The final load-bearing pillar had been knocked loose. The trap was fully assembled, its steel jaws cranked wide and locked. Stratton regarded me with an expression I had never seen from him before, something close to genuine professional respect. He asked whether I was truly prepared for the fallout. He reminded me that once the demolition crew reached the property, whatever psychological damage fell on my son would be permanent. The bridge would not just be burned, there would be no ground left to rebuild on. I rose from the leather guest chair. I gathered the torn garbage bag holding the damp ruins of my former life. I faced the dark window and watched the morning sun beginning to assert itself. I told Stratton that my son had effectively died the moment he pressed a forged signature onto those loan documents. The man sleeping upstairs in my house was not my child. He was a parasite who had made the catastrophic error of targeting the man who designed every wall around him. I told Stratton to complete the legal paperwork and prepare for what was coming. The long season of silent endurance was finished. What had begun now was something else entirely cold, surgical, and without sentiment. The heavy brass pen felt dense in my grip, denser than the chill still sitting in my coat from outside. I looked down at the final page of the transfer deed, spread across the mahogany surface. Mr. Stratton watched without speaking. My fingers carried no hesitation as I pressed the nib to the thick parchment. I wrote my name with deliberate, unhurried precision, every letter formed with the same care I had once given to a structural drawing. The black ink moved cleanly across the page, sealing the agreement and cutting the last cord binding me to the past. I watched the wet ink catch the morning light coming through the office window. I watched it settle into the paper's surface and go still. That small, quiet chemical reaction, a matter of seconds, completed the destruction of everything Caleb and Serena believed they had secured. The house was no longer a family home. It was no longer a stage for their vanity. It was now the commercial property of Beckett Hollis and his development firm. The digital clock on the wall read 8 in the morning. We had executed the fastest multi-million-dollar real estate transaction in the history of the county. Beckett had honored every aggressive condition he had agreed to. His corporate attorneys had pushed the digital wire transfer through a secure federal banking portal at speed. Stratton studied his monitor and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The funds had cleared. The capital was locked inside my protected trust account. The deed had been transferred and immediately recorded with the county clerk. I no longer held any legal stake in that structure, and Beckett assumed all physical liability from that moment forward. Now we turned to the financial theft. Stratton lifted his telephone and connected to the senior executive line of the National Bank Fraud Division. He put the call on speaker so I could hear justice beginning to move. He identified himself as my primary legal counsel and formally placed a hard fraud freeze on the joint checking account registered to Caleb and Serena Hargrove. The executive on the line asked for authorization codes. Stratton delivered them without pause, reading from his encrypted file. He stated clearly that 200 thous had been illegally extracted through a forged home equity line of credit, that the stolen funds were residing in the suspect's primary account, and that the money was actively being spent to finance a private event. The executive's keyboard was loud in the quiet room, each keystroke like a nail being driven into wood. He confirmed he had eyes on the destination account and announced they were initiating a total lockdown immediately. Nothing could move, no withdrawals, no transfers, no transactions of any kind. All connected debit cards and credit lines were suspended effective that second. He confirmed the forged signature documents would be routed to their internal investigation unit and that federal authorities would be notified regarding the wire fraud. I leaned back into the leather chair and let my eyes close. I pictured Serena waking in the master bedroom of what had been my home, descending those imported hardwood stairs, already assembling the day's agenda in her mind, reaching for her gold debit card to settle the accounts with her caterers, florists, and champagne suppliers. I could see the exact moment that card met the terminal, and the screen blinked red. Another card, then another, all of them dead at once. The first chill of panic, small cold sitting just below her ribs, spreading outward as she opened the banking app and found the account locked behind glaring red text announcing a federal fraud hold. Caleb would surface to the sound of his wife's voice coming apart in the kitchen. He would call the bank in his practiced corporate register, demand to reach a senior manager. The manager would explain with measured calm that he was currently the named subject of a federal investigation carrying a mandatory minimum prison sentence. The trap had not merely been set. The jaws had closed with the full weight of the mechanism behind them. They were sealed inside a financial disaster with no exit. Something settled quietly into my chest, a strange, durable peace. Many years ago, Diane and I had stood on that empty double lot together. The grass was high and wild, but she looked at it and saw permanence. I spent months at our small kitchen table, working through the blueprints with care. We mixed the foundation mortar ourselves and drove nails into the framing under a summer sun that didn't quit. I calculated every load-bearing wall, every sight line, every angle so that the morning light would find us gently. I built that house to stand as a fortress against the world, a place where my wife and my son would always be protected. I wanted Caleb to understand in his bones what a solid foundation actually means. But a foundation demands something in return: maintenance, respect, attention. Caleb had given it none of those things. He had seen the house only as an oversized prop, something to make him appear substantial to people whose opinions weren't worth having. He had seen my quiet, frugal life as an embarrassment to be concealed. He never grasped that real wealth moves in silence, while debt that can't sustain itself never stops making noise. He had contaminated the roots of this family willingly. He had installed a vain and calculating woman at its center, and together they had decided to discard me into a freezing autumn night, like something broken that had outlived its usefulness. They had mistaken a lifetime of patience for the confusion of old age. They had taken my stillness for absence. They assumed I was simply fading out, an inconvenient ghost, marking time, until they could collect what remained. Stratton broke the quiet and drew my attention back to the room. There were more accounts to secure, he said. He slid a fresh stack of documents across the desk. I worked through the signatures quickly without hesitation. Each one instantly revoked Serena from every authorized user list still carrying her name. They stripped Caleb from the emergency medical directives I had put in place years ago, back when trust between us still existed. If I collapsed tomorrow, my treacherous son would hold zero legal authority over my health care or my remaining assets. I was erasing him from my legal life entirely. The biological connection persisted, but every financial and legal bond between us had been burned to nothing. Stratton gathered the signed documents into a tidy stack and told me I was now effectively invisible to them. No legal leverage, no financial access, no physical shelter. When Beckett arrived at 2 hours after that afternoon, they would be trespassing on an active commercial demolition site. I glanced at the clock on Stratton's desk. 8:30 in the morning exactly. 5.5 hours until the final blow landed. 5.5 hours for the bank to formally alert federal authorities about the forgery. 5.5 hours for Serena's caterers to present their invoices, watch every card decline, and start packing up their equipment. 5.5 hours for Caleb to finally understand that the entire gilded structure he had been living inside was stolen and that it was coming down around him. I felt no pity, not a trace of remorse. The frail old man who had stood in the freezing rain clutching a garbage bag of shattered memories, he was gone. What remained was a master commercial architect who had just executed the most precise and devastating project of his career. I got up from the leather chair and pulled my damp coat straight. Stratton looked up from his keyboard and asked quietly where I intended to go. I told him first a department store for a clean, dry suit, then a comfortable folding chair and a large insulated thermos of hot black coffee. I planned to park across the street from the property at 1:45 sharp and watch Beckett's heavy diesel machinery reduce that rotting structure to bare earth. The paperwork was done. The obliteration of my ungrateful son was all but guaranteed. The afternoon sun pressed down on the freshly manicured lawn of the Hargrove family home. Expensive cars were parked bumper to bumper along both sides of the quiet suburban street. Inside, the air was dense with catered seafood and imported floral arrangements. The living room was full tailored clothes, crystal flutes, the low murmur of people performing their wealth for one another. Serena occupied the center of it all. She was holding court. The white silk dress she wore cost more than my first car. Clifford and Arlene stood just off her shoulder, surveying the open concept space with the proprietary satisfaction of people who considered it theirs by extension. Clifford swirled dark amber liquid around his glass and offered a loud compliment about the structural flow of the room. Serena rewarded him with a wide, predatory smile, She gestured upward toward the massive, exposed cedar beams above their heads, and told him she had personally designed the entire architectural layout, that it had taken months of painstaking oversight to get the contractors to execute her vision to specification. She delivered the lie without any visible effort. She erased entirely the 6 weeks I had spent on a wooden ladder with my own calloused hands, reinforcing those exact beams. Arlene reached out and ran a finger across the surface of the imported Italian marble kitchen island. She asked Serena where the old man had ended up. Serena let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that cut through the ambient noise. She waved the question away with a manicured hand. She told her mother he had been relocated to a small apartment, closer to the city, a necessary purge. She announced to the surrounding guests that I had been a suffocating dead weight, holding back their potential, that she had thoroughly sanitized the house of my grim and geriatric presence. The crowd offered murmured approval. They lifted their stolen champagne and praised her strength. On the far side of the room, Caleb stood alone beside the portable mahogany bar. He was sweating despite the climate-controlled air flowing steadily from the overhead vents. His tailored jacket pinched across the shoulders. He had a heavy crystal tumbler in one hand scotch, and he swallowed it in a single hard gulp. It was his fourth drink in under an hour. It wasn't helping. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He set the glass on the bar and drew out his phone. The screen was dark. He tapped it hard. He opened the banking application. The loading circle spun for a fraction of a second, then the dashboard appeared. What he saw was a wall of red. His primary checking account showed a balance of 0. The home equity line of credit they had illegally drawn against 8 months ago was frozen solid. A bold digital banner across the top of the screen told him to contact the Federal Fraud Department immediately. Caleb's stomach dropped. He tapped the screen again, willing it to be a glitch. He closed the app, forced a reload. The red text sat exactly where it had been. A sharp tap on his shoulder made him flinch. He turned fast and nearly sent a tall stack of clean glasses off the edge of the bar. A man in a black vest and crisp white shirt stood facing him, the lead manager of the catering company holding a slim black leather folder. The manager offered a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He explained that the remaining balance of $4,000 needed to be settled before his staff could begin the main courses. He held out a wireless payment terminal. A cold bead of sweat crawled down Caleb's spine. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the heavy gold debit card. His hands were shaking badly enough that he nearly fumbled it onto the floor. He pushed the chip into the terminal. An immediate beep. The screen flashed red. Declined. The manager pulled the terminal back and looked at Caleb with an expression that made no effort to conceal its verdict. He stated that the card had been rejected by the issuing bank. He asked for another form of payment. Caleb's throat had gone completely dry. He asked the manager to run it again. He offered a stammering explanation about daily spending limits and security flags. The manager exhaled and pushed the card into the machine a second time. Same result. The hard beep of the rejection cut cleanly through the smooth jazz, drifting from the speakers. Serena spotted the trouble from across the room, her eyes fixed on Caleb and the irritated man standing in front of him. She made her apologies to her parents and moved across the hardwood floor with deliberate grace. She seized Caleb by the elbow nails, pressing into his jacket sleeve, and hissed at him to explain what he was doing, making a scene in front of her guests. Caleb had nothing to offer. He stood there staring at the floor, eyes wide and empty. The catering manager turned to Serena and explained politely that the $4,000 payment had been declined twice, and that his staff would begin removing all food and equipment from the premises if a valid payment wasn't provided within the next 2 minutes. Serena gave a theatrical scoff. She pulled her matching gold card from her designer clutch and drove it into the terminal. She told the manager to process the charge and stop making an issue out of a simple banking error. The machine beeped. The red text appeared. Declined. Serena went still. The self-assured expression that had been fixed on her face all afternoon simply vanished. She pulled the terminal from the manager's hand and stared at the screen, thumbing the buttons, as if force of will could reverse it. The machine responded with one long, flat tone of total refusal. The manager retrieved the terminal from her trembling hands. He closed his leather folder. He announced clearly enough for the nearest guest to hear that his team was withdrawing their services effective immediately. Conversation near the bar stopped. Heads turned. The catering staff began lifting half-cleared trays of appetizers from the tables. Bartenders corked the open wine bottles and loaded them into plastic crates. The air in the room changed the warmth of the party, draining out of it as visibly as heat, leaving an open door. Clifford and Arlene pressed through the confused crowd toward the center of the commotion. Before we get to what I uncovered next, and what it would ultimately cost the people who thought they had already won, I want to ask you this: if someone you had given everything to had been quietly working against you the whole time, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait and let the truth do its own damage? Arlene demanded to know why the food was being taken away. Serena could only stare down at her gold debit card in speechless, frozen horror. Caleb stumbled back against the wooden bar. He yanked his phone out again and dialed the customer service line printed on the back of the card. He pressed it hard against his ear. The automated system didn't offer the standard greeting. It skipped the main menu entirely. The flat, robotic voice informed him that his account had been permanently locked due to a serious federal fraud investigation. It advised him to obtain legal representation immediately. The color drained from his face completely. He looked over at Serena. She was in a heated argument with the catering manager who was already steering his staff toward the front door. Caleb understood with terrifying clarity that the $200,000 they had stolen was simply gone. The $15,000 they had emptied from my daily account was equally out of reach. They had nothing left to pay the caterers. They had nothing to cover the expensive florists now disassembling the centerpieces around the room. Nothing at all. He glanced at his watch. It was pushing 2 in the afternoon. The sun was throwing long, dark shadows across the immaculate lawn outside. He had no idea the absolute worst had not yet arrived. He didn't know that the financial collapse was only the first act. He stood rooted in the center of his crumbling world, while the guests began trading whispers and drifting toward the exit. The grand illusion of their enormous wealth was fracturing into 1,000 jagged shards, right before their smugly assembled audience. Caleb shut his eyes and felt the full crushing weight of what he had done pressing down hard on his chest. The heavy front door flew inward with a violent bang. The thick wood cracked against the interior wall, and the sound thundered through the sprawling living room. The soft jazz drifting from the concealed surround sound speakers cut off instantly. A thick, dead silence dropped over the guests who remained. I stepped across the threshold and into the bright light of the entryway. I was no longer wearing the soaked cotton sweater and wet leather shoes from the night before. I had on a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. I had bought this very suit in Edinburgh 20 years ago. I used to wear it when presenting my finals architectural blueprints to hard-nosed corporate boards. It still fit exactly right. It was the armor of a man who had built empires, and I had come ready for war. I did not walk in alone. Mr. Stratton moved directly to my right, gripping a thick black leather briefcase. He carried the cold mechanical energy of a corporate executioner. Beckett Hollis flanked my left. The imposing real estate developer wore a dark, heavy coat and scuffed work boots. He dragged mud and dry dirt deliberately across Serena's imported rugs, without a moment's hesitation. Behind us came 4 large men in matching black tactical jackets, private security contractors. They carried metal clipboards and brought with them a distinctly threatening silence. They fanned out immediately across the foyer, sealing the main exit and locking down the perimeter of the room. Serena was standing near the expensive marble kitchen island. Her face was already pale and tight from her cards being declined. When she caught sight of me, her shock curdled fast into vicious cornered fury. She paid no attention to the security men behind me. She came marching across the hardwood floor, her heels striking sharp, rapid beats against the wood. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and stripped of its usual practiced elegance. "I told you to leave this property. You are trespassing. Get out of my house right now before I call the police and have you removed." Caleb was still standing frozen beside the portable mahogany bar. The empty crystal tumbler slid from his sweating fingers and exploded against the floor. He stared straight at Mr. Stratton. Caleb worked in corporate finance. He knew the posture of a high-level litigator when he saw one. He recognized the heavy quiet that preceded serious legal action. He tried to speak, but his throat had gone completely dry. He took an unsteady step forward. "Dad," he finally whispered, "what is going on here?" I did not answer my son. I simply turned to Mr. Stratton. The attorney stepped forward and set his briefcase down on the nearest dining table. He snapped the brass locks open with a clean click. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the measured precision of a surgeon selecting a very sharp instrument. He looked directly at Caleb and Serena. "Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I am the principal legal counsel for the Hargrove estate. I am here to formally notify you that your occupancy of this property is terminated effective immediately. You have exactly 20 minutes to collect your personal clothing and vacate the premises." Clifford and Arlene shouldered through the crowd of bewildered guests. Clifford thrust his chest out, reaching for his usual commanding bluster. "Now, see here," Clifford snapped, jabbing a thick finger toward my attorney. "You cannot march into my daughter's home and threaten her with hired muscle. We have established tenant rights. We will sue you for every cent you own." I looked at Clifford. I felt nothing but pure contempt for this foolish man who had so casually wheeled his heavy, hard-shell rolling trunks into my late wife's bedroom. I didn't raise my voice. I looked Clifford dead in the eyes. "You have no rights here, Clifford," I told him. "You are standing inside a property held entirely within a revocable living trust. I am the sole legal trustee. Your arrogant daughter does not own a single floorboard in this structure. She occupied it under my quiet permission, and that permission was permanently revoked the moment she and my son committed federal bank fraud." The word fraud tore through the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy guests who had moments ago been cheerfully drinking Serena's stolen champagne began murmuring and retreating in visible alarm. Serena went a deep, unnatural shade of crimson. "You are insane," she screamed, thrusting a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "You are a delusional old man. We did not commit any fraud. We took out a standard home equity loan. We are the legal homeowners." Mr. Stratton drew a crisp white document from his briefcase and raised it high for the room to see. "You forged a signature on a commercial lending contract, Mrs. Hargrove. You falsely claimed ownership of a property legally secured by a blind trust. The National Bank has already frozen your joint accounts. The federal authorities have already received our sworn legal affidavit. You do not own a home. You are holding a massive stolen debt, and the stolen funds are completely gone." Beckett stepped past me. He surveyed the beautifully decorated living room with open, unhurried contempt, the expensive floral arrangements, the temporary serving bars. Then he let out a loud, abrasive laugh that shattered what little tension still held the room together. "Listen up," he called out, his rough voice bouncing off the high cedar beams. "This property was officially sold to my commercial development firm at 8-0 this morning. It is no longer a residence. It is an active demolition site." The remaining catering staff waiting near the kitchen immediately snatched up their metal serving trays and pushed out through the back doors. The assembled guests stared at Serena and Caleb with undisguised terror. They understood they were standing inside an active crime scene. They understood their glamorous hosts were not prosperous young socialites. They were desperate, cornered thieves on the verge of federal arrest. Not one guest offered a word of sympathy or solidarity. They snatched their expensive coats and made for the front door, eyes fixed carefully away from the security contractors. Serena watched her entire carefully assembled social world flee in collective disgust. The empire she had so painstakingly constructed was dissolving into worthless dust right before her. She spun toward Caleb. "Do something," she shrieked, seizing his suit lapels and shaking him hard. "Fix this, Caleb. Tell them they are lying. Tell them this is our house. Don't just stand there." Caleb did not fight back. He looked completely hollowed out and utterly broken. The alcohol and sheer terror had stripped away whatever strength he had left. He turned to me with wide, pleading eyes. "Dad!" He choked out, his voice fracturing with raw panic. "Please! We made a terrible mistake. We were under so much pressure to keep up appearances for her parents. We will pay the money back. I swear we will pay back every single dollar. Just tell the lawyers to stop the investigation. Don't send us to a federal prison." I walked slowly toward my son. I took in the expensive tailored suit he was wearing. I looked at the imported luxury watch on his wrist, the college graduation watch I had proudly bought for him myself. I remembered clearly teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the concrete driveway outside. I remembered Diane carefully tending to his scraped knees, right there in the very kitchen where Serena now stood weeping. I felt absolutely no sorrow. What I felt was the clean, cold edge of absolute justice, nothing else. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke so quietly that Caleb had to lean in to catch my final words. You did not make a simple mistake, Caleb, I said. A mistake is an unintentional accident. What you made was a deliberate and highly calculated choice. You willfully chose to take my money. You chose to forge my legal name. You chose to throw your own father out into a freezing autumn storm so you could impress a room full of arrogant strangers. You chose this exact destination, and now you have arrived. I turned my back on him. I looked over at the head security contractor stationed by the door. Clear the property, I ordered, my voice firm and level. If they attempt to take anything beyond their personal clothing, stop them on the spot. Every piece of furniture and every appliance belongs to the trust. The large men in black jackets moved in with terrifying mechanical efficiency. They began physically steering a screaming Clifford and a sobbing Arlene toward the front door. Arlene wailed loudly about her luggage still sitting upstairs. The guards paid no attention and walked them straight out onto the porch. Beckett pulled a thick roll of construction blueprints from his deep coat pocket. He spread them out across Serena's marble kitchen island, right over a spreading puddle of expensive champagne. He produced a thick red marker and began slashing through massive sections of the original floor plan. We start tearing down the rear patio. In exactly 30 minutes, he announced, his voice filling the room. Anyone still inside the perimeter when my tractors start moving will be arrested for commercial trespassing. I walked out through the open front doors and stepped back into the crisp afternoon air. The freezing rain had finally stopped. The heavy gray clouds were pulling apart to show broad patches of clear blue sky. I stood on the wet concrete driveway and watched the massive yellow diesel tractors rolling slowly down the quiet suburban street. Their heavy steel treads rumbled against the asphalt, sending vibrations up through the ground beneath my feet. The demolition was officially underway. The heavy brass handles of the double front doors had slammed back against the freshly painted walls when I'd entered. That crash had silenced the remaining guests in an instant. I had stepped through the entryway and onto the imported rugs, wearing the dark charcoal suit I had purchased in Edinburgh 20 years ago. It was the very suit I used to wear when presenting my final architectural designs to hard-nosed corporate boards. It still fit my frame without a wrinkle. It was the armor of a man who had built empires, and I had come prepared for a total reckoning. Mr. Stratton stood directly to my right, briefcase in hand. Beckett Hollis was to my left, dragging dry dirt from his scuffed work boots straight across the pristine hardwood floors. 4 large private security contractors flanked us on both sides, sealing off the exit completely. Serena had been standing near the marble kitchen island. Her face was already drained from the humiliating episode with the catering manager, but the moment she saw me, her shock collapsed instantly into violent cornered fury. She didn't give the large men behind me a second glance. She came across the hardwood floor at a hard march, heels cracking sharply against the wood with every step. She pressed a sharp manicured finger toward my chest. She demanded to know what I was doing inside her house. She screamed that I was trespassing and ordered me out before the police arrived. She looked back at her wealthy guests, expecting them to close ranks around her and defend her social territory. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer her a single word of explanation. I thought instead about the very first time she had walked into this house, 5 years ago. I remembered how she had wrinkled her nose at the smell of old wood, shavings around my drafting table. She had always despised my presence in my own home. She had always treated my life's work as a pathetic obstacle standing between her and her grand suburban ambitions. For the past 2 years, she had been systematically erasing my history from every room. I looked at her pristine white silk dress and felt nothing, only a cold, clinical detachment. I was an architect, calmly observing a condemned building just before the wrecking ball connects. Serena kept screaming. She declared she had spent months designing the perfect open-concept living space. She announced loudly that she had personally supervised every contractor to correct the terrible errors. I had made when I originally built the structure. She called me a bitter and jealous old man who couldn't bear to watch her succeed. Clifford and Arlene stepped forward to back her up. Clifford thrust out his chest and told me I was making a spectacular fool of myself in front of very important people. He ordered me to take my hired muscle and vacate the property at once. I stayed completely silent. I turned slightly toward Mr. Stratton. The sharp attorney opened his briefcase and placed a thick stack of heavy parchment documents in my hands. I took them and stepped deliberately toward Serena, 2 slow, measured paces. She stopped screaming and stared at me with sudden, uncertain apprehension. I raised the papers and pressed them flat against the front of her expensive silk dress. She had no choice but to instinctively lift her hands and take hold of them. I watched her eyes drop to the dense black ink. I watched them move across the bold legal headers. It was the finalized transfer deed, fully notarized and officially recorded by the county clerk. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to tremble. The arrogant heat in her eyes was extinguished in an instant by a wave of cold, total terror. She looked up at me and her mouth fell open, but nothing came out. Mr. Stratton stepped forward and took command of the room. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried with the surgical precision of a seasoned courtroom litigator. He addressed the entire crowd of wealthy guests, standing in stunned silence. He introduced himself as the principal legal counsel for the Hargrove estate. He informed them that the residential property they were currently standing inside no longer belonged to a private family trust. He stated clearly that the property had been sold for a massive cash sum at exactly $200 that afternoon. The guests began trading nervous murmurs. Stratton didn't give them a moment to absorb it. He drove the revelations forward with brutal efficiency. He announced that Serena and Caleb Hargrove had never owned a single inch of the property. They had merely occupied the house under my open-handed permission. He told the crowd that permission had been permanently revoked because Caleb and Serena had executed a massive federal bank fraud. He said the words federal bank fraud with deliberate weight. He made certain every person in the room understood the precise nature of the crime. He told them my son had forged my signature to steal $200,000 to bankroll this exact pathetic performance of wealth. The room broke into chaotic whispers. The wealthy socialites who moments ago had been praising Serena's design vision now regarded her with undisguised revulsion. They understood the imported champagne in their glasses had been bought with stolen money. They understood the beautiful renovations around them had been funded by a criminal act. Serena tried to speak. She tried to tell her friends it was all a lie. She stammered that it was a simple misunderstanding over a home equity line of credit. Stratton cut her off without hesitation. He told her the National Bank had already frozen her joint accounts. He told her the federal authorities were actively processing the forged documents and preparing arrest warrants. He gestured at the transfer deed shaking in her hands. He told her she had no money and no legal shelter. She had nothing but a massive stolen debt that would lead directly to a mandatory federal prison sentence. Beckett stepped past me and planted himself in front of the crowd. He surveyed the expensive floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers with open contempt. Then he let out a loud, abrasive laugh that rolled off the high cedar beams. He told everyone to listen closely. He announced that his commercial development firm had officially purchased the double lot. This was no longer a residential home. It was an active commercial demolition site. Beckett pointed a thick finger at the front doors. He warned the guests that his heavy diesel machinery was idling directly across the street. His demolition crew, he said, was scheduled to begin tearing down the rear patio in exactly 15 minutes. Anyone still inside the perimeter when the tractors started moving would be arrested for commercial trespassing. He advised them to set their drinks on the tables and walk out of the property immediately. The wealthy guests didn't need to hear it twice. They had absolutely no loyalty to Serena or Caleb. Their only concern was protecting their own spotless reputations. Crystal flutes were set down on marble counters. Expensive appetizers were abandoned on the serving trays. They surged toward the front doors in a frantic, desperate wave. They shouldered past the large private security contractors without a glance. Not one person stopped to offer Serena a word of comfort. Not one stopped for Caleb. They evacuated the house as though the walls were already in flames. Clifford and Arlene stood completely rooted near the kitchen island. Clifford fought to hold his arrogant posture, but his face was slick with terrified sweat. Arlene began to cry softly. She looked at her daughter and asked if the accusations were true. She asked whether they had actually stolen the money to fill the house with expensive imported furniture. Serena could not answer her mother. She only stared at the legal deed in her hands while tears carved through her perfect makeup. Caleb was still planted beside the portable mahogany bar. He looked utterly destroyed. The weight of his lies had finally pressed him flat. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. He begged me to call off the lawyers. He swore he would find a way to repay every single dollar. He insisted he had only forged the documents because Serena had threatened to leave him if he failed to provide the lavish lifestyle her parents demanded. He tried to heap all the blame onto his wife in a desperate attempt to spare himself. I crossed the room slowly and came to a stop a few feet from my son. I studied his expensive tailored suit. I looked at the luxury watch on his wrist. I thought about the long, grinding hours I had put in at my drafting table to cover his college tuition. I thought about the peaceful retirement I had surrendered to give him a solid foundation to build his life on. I felt not one trace of pity for the man standing before me. I told him he had willingly traded his father away for a cheap illusion. I told him he had destroyed his own foundation, and now he would be buried under the rubble. Mr. Stratton instructed the private security contractors to begin clearing the remaining occupants. The large men in tactical jackets stepped in and physically steered Clifford and Arlene toward the front door. Arlene wailed about her hard-shell rolling trunks sitting in the upstairs guest room. The contractors ignored every word and walked them out onto the wet concrete driveway. They ordered Serena and Caleb to gather their personal clothing and clear the premises within 10 minutes. They warned that any attempt to remove furniture or appliances would be treated as felony theft against the trust. I turned my back on my son and walked out through the front doors. The freezing rain from the night before had cleared entirely, and the bright afternoon sun struck hard against the wet asphalt. I stood on the sidewalk and watched Beckett raise his heavy hand. The massive yellow diesel tractors roared to life. Their engines sent thick plumes of dark smoke rolling into the clear blue sky. The heavy steel treads bit into the pavement as the machines crawled toward the property line. The public dismantling was completely finished. The physical erasure of their arrogant empire was about to begin. The heavy parchment of the transfer deed sat in Serena's trembling hands. The room held a perfect silence for several long seconds. Then she laughed. It was a sharp, metallic sound that scraped across the high cedar beams overhead. She dropped the legal document onto the polished marble kitchen island, as though it were a crumpled receipt. She turned back to face her audience of wealthy socialites and flashed a brilliant, hollow smile. She announced loudly that the old man had finally lost his hold on reality. She framed my presence as a pathetic and desperate stunt, aimed at ruining her perfect afternoon. She looked directly at her husband, expecting him to step forward and play his assigned role as the defender of her pristine empire. She ordered Caleb to physically remove his unhinged father from her house before she was forced to involve the local police. Every eye in the sprawling living room swung immediately to Caleb. He did not move. He did not reach for his phone. He stood completely frozen beside the portable mahogany bar. All the color had left his face, replaced by a sickly, translucent pallor. A thick bead of cold sweat traced down his temple and disappeared into the collar of his tailored shirt. He was staring at the transfer deed resting on the marble counter. He recognized the heavy embossed seal of my estate attorney. Serena hissed his name. She demanded he act immediately. She grabbed his arm, but his body stayed rigid as stone. He was a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the lever to drop. He knew precisely what was coming. I watched my son buckle under the crushing gravity of his own deceit. I remembered teaching him about structural integrity when he was 12 years old. I had shown him how a single fractured support beam could eventually bring down an entire commercial complex. I had done everything I could to build a man of solid character, but he had chosen instead to construct his life out of cheap hollow plaster. Now the plaster was splitting open for the entire world to see. I moved to the center of the room. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to shout to hold the space. I spoke directly to the arrogant woman standing in my kitchen. I told Serena the deed was not a performance, and I was not leaving. I told her the house had been legally sold for cash and the transaction was permanently closed. Then I delivered the second fatal blow. I told her the sale of the physical property was merely a necessary logistical step to address a far more serious problem underneath it. I let my gaze move slowly across the crowd of impeccably dressed guests. I made sure my voice reached the very back of the room. I announced that the lavish catered food they were eating and the imported vintage champagne in their glasses had been purchased entirely with stolen funds. A collective gasp moved through the room. Crystal flutes were lowered slowly to the tables. Clifford and Arlene stepped back from the kitchen island as though the marble had suddenly caught fire. Serena demanded to know what I was talking about, her voice unsteady. The artificial confidence was draining visibly from her posture. I turned back to Caleb. I told the entire room that 8 months ago, a massive home equity line of credit had been fraudulently opened against this very property. $200,000 of pure stolen capital. I explained that the legal documents required the signature of the primary trustee. I told them my signature had been clumsily and brazenly forged by the man currently hiding beside the bar. Serena stared at me in disbelief. She turned to Caleb, expecting him to deny it, furiously to shout that I was a liar. Caleb simply closed his eyes and looked down at the hardwood floor. His silence was a deafening confession. Mr. Stratton stepped forward from the entryway. He opened his leather briefcase and produced a digital tablet. He tapped the screen and held it up for the room to see. He introduced himself as my primary legal counsel. He confirmed the financial theft with cold surgical precision. He stated that the fraudulent funds had been wired directly into a joint checking account, registered solely to Caleb and Serena Hargrove. He announced that the cash reserves had been recklessly burned through on luxury vehicles, imported designer furniture, and this very catering event. Stratton did not allow them a single second to absorb the wreckage. He immediately connected the crime to its ultimate catastrophic consequence. He looked straight at Caleb and delivered the lethal sequence of events. He stated that the National Bank had been formally notified of the forgery at 8 a.m. that morning. He laid out the brutal mechanics of commercial lending law to the silent crowd. Because the physical property had been fraudulently used as collateral, and because that exact collateral had just been legally transferred to a commercial firm, the entire $200,000 debt was instantly called due in full. The bank demanded complete repayment without delay. There would be no grace period. There would be no payment plans. Serena shrieked that they did not have $200,000 in liquid cash. In her panic, she confessed their total financial ruin to the very people she had spent years impressing. Her desperation had finally overridden her need to perform. Stratton nodded slowly. He told her that was precisely why the matter had moved well beyond a civil dispute over a loan. He announced that the bank had immediately initiated a hard fraud freeze across all their remaining assets. Every checking account, savings account, and credit line carrying their names was permanently locked. He delivered the final crushing blow without a flicker of mercy. He stated that the bank's security division had officially referred the active case to the federal authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was already processing the wire fraud and the identity theft. I watched Clifford and Arlene pull away from their daughter. The social elite have no tolerance for financial criminals. The taint of federal fraud spreads like a contagious disease through their pristine circles. The wealthy guests began inching toward the front doors. They set their expensive crystal glasses down on whatever surface was nearest. They wanted no part of a sinking ship. They wanted their physical presence erased from the scene before federal agents came through the door. The social death of Serena Hargrove was unfolding in real time, and it was total. Serena turned on Caleb. She seized his shoulders and began striking his chest with closed fists. She screamed at him. She demanded to know if it was all true. She screamed that he had promised her the house was legally his. She screamed that he had sworn the enormous influx of cash was a legitimate corporate bonus. She was coming apart in public. Her perfect suburban empire had been constructed entirely on a rotting foundation of forgery and deception, and she was crashing violently down into the reality of what she had chosen. Caleb did not defend himself. He absorbed the blows without moving. The weight of his guilt had shut down everything inside him. He looked across the room at me. He was reaching for a lifeline that no longer existed. He was banking on the bond of fatherhood to somehow override the cold mechanics of justice. He was praying I would extend the same reflexive mercy I had shown him his entire life. He genuinely believed that beneath my stillness, I would eventually break and pay the debt to pull him back from the edge. I gave him nothing. I stood without moving. The silence of my posture was the permanent execution of his hope. I remembered the exact moment I understood he had taken the money. I remembered sitting in Stratton's office staring at the clumsy forgery of my own name. I had spent 35 years absorbing the hard edges of the world so he wouldn't have to. I had sheltered him from every storm and quietly covered every failure. In return, he had handed me a cheap plastic bag of broken possessions and thrown me out into the freezing rain. The biological debt was paid in full. The ledger was closed for good. The financial guillotine had fallen. The blade was clean and the cut was complete. They had no money. They had no home. They had no future beyond a federal indictment. The unbroken chain of their arrogant choices had coiled itself tightly around their own throats. I watched the last of their wealthy friends slip out the front door, leaving them stranded in the center of a beautiful room they could no longer afford to stand in. Clifford shouldered past the retreating caterers and came straight at us. His face was a taut mask of purple fury, and his labored breathing filled the quiet room. He leveled a thick, shaking finger at Mr. Stratton and demanded to know who he thought he was. Clifford announced loudly that he kept the finest property lawyers in the city on retainer. He threatened to sue my estate and Beckett for millions in damages. He insisted we were conducting an illegal eviction and trampling basic human rights. Arlene stood directly behind him, nodding sharply. She clutched her pearl necklace and told us we were monsters for tearing apart her daughter's beautiful day. Mr. Stratton didn't so much as flinch at the outburst. He closed his leather briefcase with measured calm and regarded Clifford with an expression of pure clinical pity. He stated that tenant rights apply only to legal renters. He explained that Caleb and Serena had never been legal renters and held no valid lease agreement. They were guests occupying the property under irrevocable permission that had been permanently terminated the moment they committed federal bank fraud. Stratton told Clifford that if he genuinely wanted to phone his expensive lawyers, he should do so without delay. He advised him that his daughter was going to require a serious criminal defense team before the day was out. Beckett had run out of patience for the arguing entirely. He checked his heavy steel wristwatch and let out a loud, deliberate sigh. He looked at Clifford and told him his window for complaints had closed. Beckett raised his hand and gave a single sharp nod to the 4 security contractors near the entryway. The large men advanced in perfect mechanical unison. They walked straight past Clifford and headed directly for the expensive imported furniture Serena had bought with my stolen money. The lead contractor grabbed the edge of the custom-made cream French linen sectional. He hauled it hard across the pristine hardwood floor without a trace of care. The heavy legs gouged deep, ragged scratches into the polished wood. Serena let out a piercing, horrified scream. She ran forward and grabbed the contractor's thick arm, pleading with him to stop. She cried that the sectional had been custom-made overseas and cost $30,000. The large man ignored her grip without effort. He dragged it out through the open front doors and shoved it down the wet concrete steps. The cream linen landed heavily in the damp, muddy grass. Arlene shrieked and demanded Clifford do something to stop it. Clifford moved aggressively toward Beckett, but a security contractor stepped instantly into his path. The man crossed his arms and fixed Clifford with a flat, empty stare. Clifford stopped moving at once. Every trace of his arrogant bluster vanished the moment he met actual physical resistance. He retreated to stand beside his weeping wife, utterly powerless to protect the lavish life they had all fed on. The other contractors began methodically dismantling the party around them. They lifted the tall, crystal floral vases and dumped the expensive imported orchids straight into the trash bins. They unplugged the portable mahogany bar and drove it toward the exit. They pulled Serena's modern artwork from the freshly painted walls and carried the canvases out to the lawn. Every piece of unapproved furniture Serena had brought into the house was dragged out and dropped in the mud. The carefully curated aesthetic of her grand estate was being torn apart piece by piece in front of a live audience. Serena spun toward the remaining guests. A dozen of her closest wealthy friends were clustered near the coat closet trading whispers. These were wives of successful surgeons and corporate executives. Serena thrust her trembling hands toward them and begged someone to call the police. She pleaded for help stopping the nightmare unfolding around her. She fully expected her loyal social circle to form a wall and defend her. What she received was devastating. Not one of those women offered her a single word of comfort. They looked at her ruined, tear-streaked face with open, undisguised disgust. A tall woman in a designer coat leaned away from Serena, as though she were carrying something contagious. The woman said loudly to her husband that Serena and Caleb were nothing but common thieves. She said it was deeply pathetic how they had paraded around the country club performing wealth while secretly stealing from an old man. Serena heard every word. The social rejection cut harder than the physical eviction. Her entire identity had been built on the fragile approval of these people. She had traded her integrity and manipulated my son purely to purchase her way into their exclusive world. Now that world was rejecting her and bolting the door behind her. The guests quickly fastened their expensive coats and filed out the front door. They stepped around the discarded cream sectionals sitting in the mud. They offered no farewell to their hosts. They simply removed Serena from their lives without a backward glance. Caleb stayed frozen near the kitchen island. He watched his wife drop to her knees in the middle of the empty living room. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed without restraint as her former friends pulled away in their luxury vehicles. He couldn't bring himself to cross the room and go to her. He understood that any comforting words would be a hollow, useless lie. He had promised her a grand suburban empire and delivered a federal indictment. He stared at the deep, ugly gouges in the hardwood floor. He was watching his entire life dissolve, and he did not have the courage to do a thing about it. Beckett stood over Serena and told her she had exactly 5 minutes to walk out the front door before his men carried her out themselves. He told her his demolition crew had been waiting in the cold long enough, and they were ready to start moving the heavy machinery. I stood near the doorway and watched the complete destruction of their arrogant illusions. I had given them every opportunity to be decent human beings. I had offered them the shelter of my home and the warmth of my family. They had chosen to spit on my legacy and strip away my security. Now they would discover how cold the real world is when you deliberately burn down the only roof above your head. The massive yellow tractors roared outside, sending vibrations up through the hardwood floor beneath our feet. Caleb could no longer hold himself upright. His knees gave out entirely. He dropped heavily onto the floor in the dead center of the vast, empty living room. The sharp, hollow crack of his kneecaps striking the wood ricocheted off the high cedar beams overhead. He pitched forward and buried his sweating face in his trembling hands. His shoulders heaved beneath the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. He began to weep without any restraint. It was not quiet or dignified grief. It was the loud, wretched sobbing of a broken man who had finally understood that everything he had built was permanently gone. He lifted his head and looked up at me, thick tears running down his flushed face. His eyes were wide and swimming with naked terror. He stretched a shaking hand toward my polished leather shoes. He looked nothing at all like the smug corporate executive who had coldly locked me out of my own home just months before. The heavy mask of superiority had dissolved entirely. He had been reduced to a frightened, desperate child reaching for an impossible miracle. "Dad, please," he choked out between ragged, agonizing sobs. "You have to stop them. You have to call the bank right now and tell them it was a simple misunderstanding. I will sign anything you want me to sign. I will work every single day for the rest of my natural life to pay back every single dollar we took. Just please do not let them send me to a federal prison." I looked down at his weeping form without moving an inch. I asked him quietly why he did it. I asked him why he deliberately chose to forge my legal signature and steal $200,000 from his own father. Caleb dragged his wet face across his expensive silk sleeve, smearing tears and sweat into the fabric. He jabbed a shaking finger toward the open front door through which Serena had just fled. He immediately laid the entire criminal operation at his wife's feet. He swore he never wanted to steal the money. He cried that Serena had threatened to file for divorce and leave the state if he failed to provide the lavish, upper-class lifestyle her wealthy parents expected. He claimed the relentless social pressure had been suffocating him completely. He said she endlessly demanded imported marble counters and leased luxury cars, and he was terrified of losing her. He begged me to understand his pathetic position. He wanted me to believe he had committed massive federal fraud, only to salvage his crumbling marriage. He actually thought I would feel sorry for him. He genuinely believed his cowardly excuses would somehow release the lock on my paternal mercy. I looked down at the man groveling on my floor and felt a deep, chilling emptiness spread through my chest. I told him to stop crying and look me in the eyes. Caleb slowly raised his head. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke moved through the quiet room like a heavy steel blade. I told him he knew absolutely nothing about real pressure or genuine survival. I told him about a freezing dark winter night exactly 44 years ago. I was just 16 years old when my father died and left me with a mountain of debt and nothing else. I became an orphan overnight. I had no wealthy family to fall back on when things fell apart. I had no financial safety net waiting beneath me. I survived entirely alone on unforgiving city streets. I worked brutal manual labor shifts, hauling heavy bricks and mixing concrete just to afford a single hot meal each day. I spent freezing nights sleeping in dangerous bus stations and studying torn architectural textbooks under the flickering yellow glow of street lamps. I bled for every single penny I ever earned. I dragged myself out of crushing poverty through sheer relentless willpower so that my children would never have to feel the agonizing bite of real hunger. I built an entire legacy from nothing with my own two hands. I poured my blood and sweat into the deep foundation of this very house, so my family would always have a permanent fortress against a harsh and unforgiving world. I pointed a stiff finger at his expensive leather shoes and his custom-tailored jacket. I told him he had been handed a pristine, secure empire on a silver platter. He had never once had to worry about finding shelter, or buying food, or enduring a freezing winter. He had been given absolute generational security, and he willingly chose to burn every last piece of that beautiful legacy to the ground. I told him he had sold my lifelong blood and sacrifice for absolute garbage. He had traded a rock-solid foundation for catered seafood and leased luxury vehicles he could never actually afford. He had thrown his own devoted father out into a freezing autumn storm, purely to impress a room full of shallow, arrogant strangers who abandoned him the instant his credit cards were declined. He chose the fragile, pathetic illusion of wealth over the basic reality of honor and human decency. He let a cruel, arrogant woman manipulate him into committing a serious federal felony. He was completely and utterly pathetic. I told him I felt no pity whatsoever for his tears. I told him he was no longer my son. The boy I had raised was gone. The man kneeling before me was nothing but a cowardly thief, sitting in the rubble of his own destroyed life. Caleb wailed and lurched forward to seize the cuff of my trousers. I pulled my leg back without hurry and stepped clear of his desperate grasp. Mr. Stratton stepped forward and glanced at his digital watch. He announced that time was officially up. The heavy diesel tractors outside responded immediately, revving their massive engines. The deep guttural grinding shook the glass in the large custom windows. Then a different sound cut through the crisp afternoon air. It was faint at first, then it grew rapidly louder and more intense with every second, the high-pitched wail of police sirens echoing down the quiet suburban street. The sound multiplied as several patrol cruisers closed hard on the neighborhood. The bank fraud division had finished processing the forged loan documents, and the federal authorities were arriving to collect their primary suspect. Caleb heard the approaching sirens and went completely rigid. Every muscle in his body locked into a posture of pure, uncut panic. He scrambled backward across the scratched hardwood floor like a cornered animal. He looked frantically toward the rear patio doors, hunting for an escape route. But Beckett Hollis was already there blocking the exit, with his thick arms folded across his chest. There was nowhere left to go. The sirens grew louder and louder until they were screaming directly outside on the front lawn. I watched two heavy police cruisers roll straight across Serena's perfectly manicured grass and brake hard. Red and blue lights erupted through the large living room windows, throwing harsh, unnatural shadows across the bare white walls. The trap had snapped permanently shut. The steel jaws were locked tight around his ankles, and the key was gone for good. I turned my back on the weeping thief crumpled on the floor and moved slowly toward the front door. I stepped onto the wet porch, to meet the arriving federal agents in person. I was ready to hand them the final pieces of financial evidence they needed to put him away in a concrete cell for a very long time. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked with a steady, deliberate pace toward the open front doors. The heavy boots of the private security contractors parted in silence to let me through the entryway. Behind me, Serena unleashed a piercing, guttural scream. She cursed my name and shrieked that I was a complete monster. Her voice fractured with total hysteria as she watched the wealthy illusion she had so carefully assembled shatter into a million jagged pieces. I crossed the threshold and stepped onto the damp concrete of the front porch. The cold afternoon air hit my face and filled my lungs with a sharp, overwhelming sense of clarity. I had been living inside a suffocating fog of disappointment for years. Today the fog was permanently lifted. I walked down the wide brick pathway I had laid with my own hands 30 years ago. I remembered the blistering summer afternoons spent leveling the dirt and hauling the heavy red bricks, one by one. I had built that path so my son would have a safe, beautiful place to ride his bicycle. I had built the house behind me so my family would never know the bitter chill of a rented apartment with broken heating. I had constructed an impenetrable fortress of security. But I had forgotten the most fundamental rule of structural engineering. You cannot raise a lasting monument on a foundation of rotted timber. Caleb was rotten. Greed and vanity had hollowed him out, completely carved away everything solid that once lived inside him. He had sold his own father down the river to lease German luxury cars and stack tables with imported caviar for people who privately held him in contempt. Mr. Stratton walked quietly at my side, his thick leather briefcase held firmly against his chest. His expensive shoes clicked against the wet pavement in a steady metronomic rhythm. He didn't glance back at the house. He moved with the cold, flawless precision of a surgeon who had just cleanly amputated a gangrenous limb. His voice was low and measured as we approached the end of the driveway. He told me the massive offshore wire transfers had officially cleared the international banking algorithms exactly 4 minutes ago. Every dollar of my personal wealth was now fully liquid, heavily encrypted, and locked inside a secure overseas trust. The accounts sat behind a dense wall of anonymous corporate entities, impenetrable. No federal judge and no bankruptcy lawyer, however desperate, would ever trace or touch a single penny. My life's legacy was safely insulated from the enormous financial crater my son had so foolishly excavated for himself. I nodded slowly, absorbing the vast relief that moved through me like a tide. I looked out along the quiet suburban street. The heavy yellow diesel tractors idled at the curb, their engines rumbling with patient menace. The demolition crews waited for the police to finish their arrests before they started pulling those walls down to bare foundation. Farther along the road, a sleek black town car sat parked in the shadow of a large oak tree. Its engine ran in near silence. The driver stood beside the rear passenger door in a crisp, dark suit, holding himself with professional stillness, ready to carry me away from the wreckage of everything I was leaving behind. The wail of police sirens grew deafening as 2 more federal cruisers came skidding around the corner, parking aggressively on the wet grass and tearing deep, muddy ruts into Serena's immaculate landscaping. Heavy doors burst open and federal agents in dark tactical jackets came rushing up the brick pathway I was currently walking down. They swept past me without a second glance, their eyes fixed entirely on the open front doors of the house. They carried clear legal authority to execute multiple felony arrest warrants, massive wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. I didn't slow down to watch them go in. I had no desire to see the cold steel handcuffs snap shut around my son's wrists. I had already watched his soul go dark. Witnessing the end of his physical freedom held nothing for me. I reached the property line and stepped onto the wet asphalt. A strange and profound emptiness settled into the hollow, where my fatherly devotion had once lived. My entire adult life had been spent trying to shape Caleb into a man of genuine honor. I had paid for the finest private schools, brought in the most expensive tutors, granted him every advantage the universe had brutally withheld from me when I was a starving orphan at 16. I had shielded him from poverty's anguish and the savage reality of true survival. I understood now that all that protection had been a catastrophic error. A muscle that meets no resistance will eventually wither and die. By clearing every obstacle from his road, I had inadvertently built a weak and cowardly man, one who crumbled under the faintest pressure from an arrogant woman. Mr. Stratton stopped beside the black town car and turned to face me. He extended his hand and offered a firm professional handshake. He said it had been an absolute honor to carry out my final directives. He assured me his legal firm would monitor the federal fraud case closely and guarantee that my name stayed entirely clear of the coming criminal indictments. He told me that Caleb and Serena would stand before the federal prosecutors completely alone, no access to my legal resources, no hope of a financial lifeline. They were utterly isolated inside the toxic wreckage of their own making. I shook his hand and told him he had earned every dollar of his considerable retainer. I turned toward the waiting car. The driver pulled the heavy door open and stepped respectfully aside. I paused for a fraction of a second and looked back down the suburban street. Red and blue police lights strobed wildly off the wet leaves of the oak trees. Federal agents were marching a weeping Caleb out through the front doors. His hands were bound tightly behind his back. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled and streaked with dirt from his pathetic collapse on the floor. Serena was being dragged out right behind him. She was screaming at the officers, thrashing against the handcuffs, kicking her expensive heels frantically in the air. Her silk dress was smeared with dark mud, and her carefully arranged hair had come apart into a ruined, tangled wreck. She looked completely unraveled. The wealthy neighbors had emerged onto their front porches and were filming her humiliating arrest on their phones. Her deepest nightmare had finally crystallized into permanent reality. She was going to be the absolute laughingstock of the entire county. I felt nothing at all as they pushed my son into the back of the police cruiser. The biological cord that had once connected us had been severed, cut by his own treacherous hands. He was a stranger to me now, just another desperate criminal being loaded into the cold machinery of the justice system. The rotting branch of my lineage had been removed entirely before the spreading infection could claim the rest of the tree. I turned my eyes forward and fixed them on the dark-tinted windows of the town car. My future was waiting on the other side of that glass. I slid into the plush leather seat and felt the soft, ambient warmth of the cabin close around me. I settled deep into the upholstery and let out a long, slow breath. I reached into my breast pocket and drew out a crisp, white envelope holding my first-class plane tickets. My final destination was a quiet, beautiful coastal town on the far side of the country, a place where no one recognized my face and no one expected a single thing from me. I was going to purchase a small, modest house perched above the crashing gray waves. I was going to spend whatever years remained breathing crisp, salt air and working through thick historical biographies on a still wooden porch. I was going to savor the absolute total peace I had so violently earned. The driver came around to the front. He settled behind the wheel and caught my eye in the rearview mirror. He asked quietly whether I was ready to head to the international airport. I looked at his reflection and gave one slow, definitive nod. I told him I was more than ready. I told him to drive and not stop for anything. The engine purred smoothly as the car eased away from the curb. I looked straight ahead at the dark, wet road unfurling before me. The flashing police lights shrank rapidly in the side mirrors until they were nothing but faint, distant sparks dissolving into the gray afternoon. The screaming of my former daughter-in-law and the groan of the diesel demolition engines fell away completely absorbed into the quiet hum of the luxury interior. The crushing weight of the past lifted away for good. I was entirely free. The wreckage of my old life was locked in the rear-view mirror, receding with every passing second, sealed off at last by the deeply satisfying, decisive click of the heavy car doors shutting behind me. And that was how it ended. Not with shouting, not with pleading, with a car door closing a road opening up ahead, and everything I had built still standing in my name on my terms. Looking back, I understand now what that season of my life truly cost me. It cost me the version of Caleb I had believed in. It cost me years of misplaced faith in people who were counting my money while I was counting my blessings. I believe God allows certain betrayals to reach their full depth before he moves not to break us, but to show us what we were never meant to carry alone. The stripping away of everything false was the only path to anything real. If this story taught me anything worth passing on, let it be this. Never place your financial security entirely in the hands of someone whose loyalty you have not tested under pressure. If the people around you only show up when resources are flowing, their devotion belongs to the resources, not to you. Silence and preparation are more powerful than any confrontation you could ever stage in the heat of the moment. And when blood ties become a weapon used against you, cutting them is not cruelty, it is survival, and it is the only honest thing left to do. If this story moved you, I hope you will leave a thought in the comments. I read them, and your voice matters here. If you know someone who needs to hear a story like this, share it with them. And if you have not yet subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, now is a good time. There is more to come. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until the next one, take care of yourself.